Perfect. So I didn't put any makeup on.
Yeah, just going to be recording only. And are you recording on your end or?
I can do a recording on my end.
Okay, perfect. If you don't mind, that way we just have a backup. And then I'm going to hit my button right here. And we're good. All right. And Milana, where are you out of?
I am currently in my home in Sherman Oaks, California.
California. Okay, cool. All right.
Yeah.
On this episode of the Business Side of Music, all the way from Sherman Oaks, California, part of my old stomping grounds back in the 90s, Milana Rabkin Lewis is with us, who is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of STEM. For those of you that don't know what STEM is, it's the leading distribution, payment, and financing solution built to simplify the process of releasing music in today's industry and designed to empower artists and their teams to run their business truly independently. That in itself is a mouthful. Milana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And if you have better feedback, we'll pass it along to the PR team to rewrite that boilerplate.
Hey, it's fine. So we always like to start with our guests telling us a little bit about where they come from and what they're all about. And I read your bio, and you're not a new kid on the block. You've been doing this for a while. You've got quite the history. How did you get started?
Yeah. So I've never really worked in music prior to STEM. I've always been focused on digital media, new models of monetizing and funding content, and how do you support and help creators build a business. Mm-hmm. And that's primarily what I was doing prior to founding STEM at UTA. And prior to that, I trained to be a talent agent, specifically focused on representing screenwriters and directors, and became obsessed with independent storytelling. And what better format to do that in than music?
When you talk about you were working for UTA as in an agency capacity, and of course, I guess you also spent some time at Endeavor, which wound up being William Morris. Mm-hmm. You were working in really a little bit of a different world when you talk about the screenwriters and that aspect of thing, but it's still all creative souls. And we use that word a lot, but I mean, it's all creative people that really are just trying to figure out what to do and how to do it and et cetera.
Yeah, I think of them as creative entrepreneurs.
So when you started STEM, what was the drive to create the formation of that company?
Yeah. So let's sort of paint a picture of the context that we were living in. It was about so we started the company in 2015. I started having the idea come to me in 2012. And 2012, at that point in the business, what we saw was a lot of talent emerging off of platforms like Spotify and YouTube and SoundCloud. And on top of that, there were a lot more ways to distribute your content. It was cheaper to produce the content because the technology existed to make things at home versus in a studio with mobile devices, right? Mm-hmm. And you can monetize it more and more frequently on social platforms, right? So this is around the time that YouTube really started monetizing in a bigger way, and SoundCloud started thinking about their monetization strategy. And digital distribution just became a lot more accessible. You didn't need a big institution to get your content out there. And yet a lot about how content's created in terms of the way that people collaborate only kept getting more complex, not simplified. You started having more and more people collaborating, and the collaborations involved people getting paid on the back end because more and more content was being made independently. So you didn't have a studio that was willing to pay for people to come together and make music or make video. People were doing it on their own, and they would agree, hey, we're going to do this. None of us are going to get paid up front. We're all doing it for the upside on the back end. And the one thing that technology had not yet solved for was, how do you pay people on the back end? So in a world where more content's being produced because the barrier to entry has been eliminated, there's more and more places to distribute that content, and more of those places are making money. Now you have money being made from your content from multiple sources in multiple different monetization ways. And yet one person not a company. One person has to collect that money and pay other people. And I was just amazed that there wasn't a solution that was really looking forward at the business. There were tons of royalty solutions that were built for accountants and, all these archaic ways of doing calculations, but there was nothing adapting to the new way of producing and monetizing content. And so I looked at other tech companies and businesses for inspiration. I looked at companies like Square and Venmo and PayPal, and I thought, there's a whole new wave of innovative companies that are building financial tools and services for small business owners. Why is no one building anything for my business owners, which are creators? And that was sort of the impetus that got me thinking about STEM.
When we talk about the independent artist, when we talk about that individual creative person, most of them, and we talk about this a lot, and it seems like sometimes I'm beating that dead horse, but a lot of them are just that. They're creative individuals, and there's very little, if any, business sense attached to them. Now, there is the rare breed out there that can think right brain and left brain at the same time and understand these equations. But from a monetary aspect, especially in this world, when we talk about things like Spotify, and you read it all the time about, hey, I just had 8 million downloads and I got a check for $14. Is it tougher for that individual to make money today compared to, say, what it was if they had a contract or a record deal or a writing deal? Can they go out and be successful on their own as an independent and make money?
Great. So can I actually unpack that into 2 to 3 different questions that you're asking?
Sure.
So I want to address the first part of what you were saying, which is that there's this assumption that creators aren't business people. And it is like every bone of my being to completely change that perception, right? Like I want to demystify that. And what I would argue is that most founders aren't business people either of companies, right? They're visionaries. And it's in building that team that you build the competency to understand how the business works. So, there's a framework that we as a business follow called EOS. It's called the Entrepreneur's Operating System. And it's a framework for how you run your company, set vision, make sure you're getting traction by tracking the measurables and the goals, how you align people on the objectives, how you reward them, how you think about org structure. It's like a holistic system for running a business. And as a part of it, they have a recommended org structure, which they call an accountability chart. And the way that they recommend it, and this is something that all kinds of businesses use, right? There's, I think, like 50,000 companies across the US, if not more, that are operating on the EOS system. And they have the structure called the visionary and the operator and the integrator. And what that states is that there's the person who has the vision, and oftentimes that's the CEO. And then there's the person right next to them who's the integrator, and their job is to execute that vision by putting together the right team, the right resources, the right strategy to execute against it. And many businesses function under that kind of a structure. And I think that artists are no different, right? An artist is the visionary. And in many cases, they bring on an operator, an integrator, and a manager whose job it is to manage that business with them. But the more they are in the center of their business, the more they have visibility of their business, the more literacy they're able to gain around the finances, around the sort of strategy component of it. And I think that there's definitely some founders that are financially literate. There's also a lot of artists who are. And I think for us, our primary focus as a business is to make decision-making simpler. And the way that we believe we can do that on the strategy side for an artist is by showing data with dollar signs in front of it. Because to your point, there's a lot of misunderstanding around, what are the metrics that matter for an artist? Is it number of streams, number of views, number of listeners, number of followers, or is it dollars? And the correlation between the two isn't always exact, right? And that's one thing I noticed when we were starting STEM in 2015 is that my clients would have so much data that they had access to and so many data points that were misguiding because they would see that their followership was growing. There were more and more people listening to their music and streams were growing. And then like a year later, they would get the check and they'd be like, wait, this is not that much money. And so to the second point of your question, which was like, can they do it independently? I think absolutely. But I think not all artists can be independent or not, they're not meant to be independent. But what I'm excited about is that in today's music industry, there's a service offering that caters to every type of artist across the ranges of what that artist is looking for in terms of support. There's some that need a turnkey 360 solution, and those are great places. There's great major labels to go to for that. There's some that need a hybrid. There's some that want to put together resources a la carte and have access to a ton of capital, but still be able to operate autonomously. And there's some that want to do everything 100% independent. And what's great is that there's an offering for each one. And what we're starting to see is the evolution of the economics behind each of these arrangements evolve as well to be more in line with the value exchange.
In the studio with us today, all the way from Sherman Oaks, California, Milana Rabkin Lewis, who's the CEO and co-founder of STEM. Let's talk a little bit about STEM. We know why you created it, why it was started. Let's talk about what STEM can provide to the client.
So we have a couple of different parts of our offering, and the goal is for them to all be interconnected today. In the future, that might not be the case. But today, clients come to us initially to get their content distributed to all the major services out there, from Spotify to Peloton to TikTok and all the various streaming and social apps that exist. The thing that we innovated on and pioneered was the concept of connecting the distribution and the revenue from that distributed content to the royalty accounting process to make sure that, sorry, excuse me, I almost had to sneeze, to make sure that as the money was coming in, it was automatically being paid and split across all the various people that got a piece of the back end of the song. So whether it's the songwriters and producers to some more or less obvious people that because of our system, we've seen getting paid back. So for example, friends and family that come on as investors, influencers that are tied into a campaign to help promote a song, the visual directors, the designers, the digital graphic designers, et cetera, right? So we're starting to see a whole different type of collaborator get paid on the back end because of STEM. Now that we have multiple people getting paid by STEM, the next thing we decided to do was offer access to capital to those individuals so that they could continue to invest in their careers. And that was a product called Scale that we launched in 2020. We did not mean to launch it around the beginning of COVID, but it just happened to be the timing. And what we saw was some artists definitely using the capital to invest in themselves and others using it just to close the gap from missing wages, right? So being able to access money from the revenue of the assets of your songs that you have access to and getting a pipeline advance so that you could use that money just to live. We also saw some people using taking an advance to buy property to help put down towards a down payment for a mortgage. And so what we've seen for STEM is a real opportunity to create additional financing products and services to our clients. And that's definitely something you're going to see us evolve over time. And then just this year, or not this year, sorry, we're in 2022 and 2021, this past year, we launched the next iteration of sort of the payments products for STEM, which we call Recruitment Tracking. As you guys all know, I'm sure being the business, splitting revenue isn't as simple as agreeing on percentages and paying that off every time money comes in. Someone put up the capital and someone has to get paid back first. And there's typically different rules that dictate how producers and songwriters get paid and whether or not they stand behind marketing cost or, all these different configurations that are norms in our business. So we built a product to streamline all of that and to be able to eliminate more accounting burden from our clients. That product's been incredibly interesting to develop because it's forced us to unpack a lot of the questions of why do these rules exist? Why does this logic exist? And it's fascinating because it all comes back to the fundamental pain point that people in the music business don't trust each other to get paid.
That is a big part of it. And the other thing you mentioned is the pecking order of who gets paid and when and how, and those formulations that take place, because we've talked to publishers in the past and they can't really, or maybe they're not willing to talk about what that formula is. Is that something that you simplify when it comes down to splitting the proceeds of a project to the artist, to the creator?
We definitely try to. What's been really interesting is, so let's talk about producers and songwriters, right? One of the complexities there is that producers, when they get a piece of the master and they're working with a major label, still ask for a producer advance. And the reason why they do that is because they don't trust that they're ever going to see another dollar. So they try to predict how that song's going to perform, put a dollar value on it, and ask for that up front. And what that does is it forces additional complications, because now you have the advance on the budget of the song and all the expenses, but then you have individuals that are recouping advances as well. And there's different rules, like you said, about who gets paid what. Now, when we would take the same language from a legal contract on a producer agreement, for example, and we would sit down 3 or 4 different accountants and business managers and ask them in Excel to model out how they would calculate these royalties and these payouts based on the exact same revenue that came in and the exact same budget. What we saw is that everyone does it differently. And that was incredibly fucked up to learn.
And were the valuations the same from each of these individuals, or was it all over the spectrum?
No, what we said was, so it wasn't even the valuation. We just said, okay, here's a song that's generated 20,000 the first month, 30,000 the second, and 40,000 in the third, right? Here are the splits. The splits were exactly the same in all scenarios. And here were the budgets, right? So there was this marketing spend, this production spend, these recording costs, and these advances were given to various individuals. Do the math. Exact same scenario for 3 or 4 different accountants and business managers. Each one did the calculations entirely different. So what we learned is that there's no standard way of doing it.
Right.
And this is a huge problem for us to uncover. And it's one of the things that we're trying to standardize. So what we're hoping for is we pick the path that we believe to be most artist friendly, because there's definitely ways of doing the math that are more label friendly. And we want to do it in a way where our system takes the complexity out of it. We can get most lawyers and business managers to align on the way that we're setting up the calculations and streamline this, take it from legal jargon and make it into an interface that is super simple for even an admin to use, not necessarily like an accountant or finance person, although if they want to use it, then amazing, and it's going to take the complexity out of their workflows.
Are you getting any kind of a pushback from them, or are they being fairly acceptable to what you're creating there?
It's a good question. So the first version of Recoup was a lot simpler. That one's been fairly easily adopted. It's not that controversial because all the money comes off the top and then you split it. We haven't yet released the next version of Recoup that has all this complexity because we're still trying to get alignment 6 months later.
Yeah, I'd say it's got to be a battle for you in some aspects. When the artist creates, let me see how I can say this. When the artist creates that body of work, is there a valuation that can be set at that time, or is that spec? When we talk about getting in advance, how is that determined? What is that valuation determination?
Yeah, so we have 3 different ways of offering advances. The sort of least risky one is based on historicals of revenue on catalog, and we just advance a couple of years of pipeline on that, and we look at the historical decay curves of the song and the release and benchmark it against other data we have in our system to predict the performance of it in the future. That methodology for us includes a couple of other sort of proprietary data points we look at that impact the way that we model that decay curve, but that's how we approach that. The second one that's slightly more risky is when we give credit for new releases. So we look at historical revenue on catalog, plus they give us the release schedule, new releases, and we layer that in based on what we assume those new projects are going to perform at and how they're going to change over the next, call it 2 to 3 years. And then the third bucket, which is the most risky, which is one that we're actually pretty amazed at our accuracy on, is when we don't have exact data in our system on the performance of the historical catalog, but we're using Nielsen data and other data sources that are more publicly available to us to look at how their historical catalog has performed and use that data to predict how their new releases are going to perform. This is on the master side, which is a very different way of approaching it than on the music publishing side that I think a lot of the other buyers in the space are looking at. For us, currently, we are a lot more confident, and we're obviously a lot more conservative in our underwriting because we're only predicting 3 years out on average, which is very different than having to predict 20 years out, which is what a lot of these catalog buyers are looking at. So in terms of valuations, I wouldn't say we're necessarily putting a valuation on it because we're looking at such a short duration. I think we're just more predicting future cash flow.
Does the market allow, well, let me back up a little bit and say this, ask you this. The market's constantly changing. And one of the things you mentioned was Peloton. And that's a platform that, did we even think about 2 or 3 years ago? I mean, there's these constant new music platforms, social platforms that can create revenue. They're generators of money. Are they all different, or can the same basic principle, like I said, you mentioned Peloton, is it the same formula for all of them, or is each one a little different?
It's a great question. I think there's a couple of things we think about here. So one, to your point, this is a type of consumption that we did not anticipate being a primary driver of growth, call it even 5 years ago, right? And this is the thing that a lot of the major labels that are public today are touting in their financials, and sort of why the big bet is on their futures, because they believe that these services are just getting started and the current monetization is low, but that the monetization will increase over time as these services get more adoption and as they have more leverage against these services to negotiate better deals and terms. I would put TikTok in a separate bucket and the social streaming one. And that one's really interesting because the monetization on that is awful right now. It is by far the worst monetized platform out of all of them, based on how many streams it takes to get to $1. And we saw that 10 years ago with YouTube. YouTube was really poorly monetized, and now it's in the top 5 in terms of best monetized platforms. So I think the bet is really accurate, or not accurate. It's one worth making, that these social streaming services and these connected home devices that are currently driving good consumption and good discovery, but really poor monetization, are going to change, that there's going to be a correction at some point. And I would say that, the other exciting thing about the ecosystem today is that there's so much different shelf space for an artist, right? It used to be, as an artist, you were either someone that can sell CDs and sell tickets, or you had no opportunity. And with streaming, you had an emergence of artists who could stream and could build a business just by being successful on streaming services. And maybe we're not so great at touring or selling hard tickets, and we're better at a festival lineup or doing private shows. And that's how they made their money on live. And with, the introduction of social content platforms like TikTok, you're seeing a whole different breed of creator in the music space emerge that's really catchy in 15 to 30 seconds, that can create clippets of songs, or even just segments of music that other people want to adopt and use it as a soundtrack to their own storytelling. And so I think that there's very few artists who are incredibly successful at doing all of those things, selling hard tickets, selling physical, streaming, and social. And those are what are going to be the new global superstars. And I think that there's just so much more shelf space for so many more different types of artists to be able to monetize and make content across any of these different channels or formats.
I'm so glad you said that, because going back 20 years, the record business was entirely different. First of all, we didn't have the competition that's out there today. And you mentioned TikTok and Spotify and YouTube. Back then it was, you got your music in the store. When you talk about shelf space, you had so many cubicles of storage to stack the CDs and sell them. And if you were real fortunate and your label spent the money, then you would either get an end cap or you'd get a POD somewhere in a store. But it was typically limited to the top 30, top 40 artists of whatever genre, not necessarily specific. Now, because it's such a wild west, so to speak, it's so open out there for anybody to make it. Does that get a little diluted? How does the independent artist get above all that white noise to be successful?
Yeah. You bring up a really good point, and something I think about quite a bit, which is, are we living in the cult of the amateur, and is that hurting us? Is that actually hurting artists' ability to succeed? I think that it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, the capacity for new artists to emerge is greater than it's ever been. There's so many more opportunities for artists to emerge. And yet, in a world where there's, I don't even know what the new number is, but a couple of years ago, or even a year ago, Spotify said there's 60,000 new songs a day.
Wow.
Right? Like, that's nuts. I actually think that is antithetical to their mission, right? Daniel talks a lot about wanting to have 1 million creators being able to live off their art. And to you using the point, is it dilutive? I think it could be, when you have that many people competing for attention and the average attention span of the consumer is shortening. But I think one thing that still remains true is that for a song to become a hit or for it to resonate, people need to hear it in different contexts, right? Like, that's why radio is so important, is because you play the same song and spin it multiple times throughout the day. And that's how it would become catchy. Like, people would consume it and it would be shoved down their throats to a certain extent, but it also allowed for the song to breathe and to live and to have a life. And now if something's not trending after the first couple of weeks of release, like, it's considered dead in the water. And some have been able to revive it and create incredible success by launching it through a different channel, right? Like, I think the Glass Animal song is an incredible case study of the last year, where when that song initially came out on streaming, didn't get the kind of traction that I think they were hoping for. They put money towards a TikTok campaign and that song blew up. And it impacted the streams, the conversion on streaming. And that song hit it through the charts and became a huge global phenomenon last year. But I do think that it makes it harder to stand out when there's so much volume of content. And I hope that there's going to be some kind of a correction for it as well, to be honest.
On the show with us today, Milana Rabkin Lewis, who is the CEO and co-founder of STEM. Let's talk about real quick how people can find STEM and how they can get involved.
Yeah. You can visit us on our website, www.stem.is. Unfortunately, stem.com is owned by a public company in the energy space, so we have to take a .is for now. If you are interested in working with us, you can apply on our website to become a member and become part of our ecosystem. We are currently invite only and, very selective and curate the types of people we can support, and want to make sure that we can extend a great experience for everyone that we take on.
Who are you looking for? What type of creative person are you looking?
It's a great question. really it comes down to, are you a creative business, right? There's artists who have their own label that are at that scale where they have a real team behind them, and we can extend our tools and they're highly collaborative. Those are typically the best types of clients we work with. So it's artists who are operating as their own label, or labels that are emerging that are independent, that really need tools. For us, our differentiation point, again, isn't about helping an artist get off the ground, which I think a lot of other DIY distributors do. Ours is really around getting people paid. So the types of businesses and clients we look for are ones where there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of individuals, a lot of people that are participating in the back end, where we can stand out and ensure that everyone gets paid in a clear and timely manner, but also with a human experience from our artist relations team, where they can actually help level up the existing team, augment their relationships, and, combining that power of technology with the human experience is something that we think is really important to do.
Very good. And what's the website again where they can find you?
www.stem.is.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you too for having me as a guest.
All right. I think we're good. That was
Thank you,
good.
guys.
That was a lot of information. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for getting the conversation going in the right way.
We will. We'll when we have a release date, we will let you folks know and we'll get it out there. And if we need anything else, Lindsay, I'll get a hold of you.
Sounds like a
Wonderful.
plan, Bob.
All right.
Thanks, Bob.
Ladies, thank you so much.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.